wasn't funny. Anyway, today, Brian Holt is graciously agreed to come in and help us out at last minute. I really did hit him up last minute, and he just stepped right up to the plate. So thank you so much for that, Brian. We're glad you're here. So come on up here. You guys welcome Brian, please. We're glad you're here, man.
So glad to be here.
Let's see what God has for us.
All right. Let me hit this once before I get started because my throat's a little raw. You don't have to live very long until you realize that life stinks. Am I not being truthful? And you know, the reason why life can be so tough at times is one can be our own actions. We end up doing something that's stupid, foolish, unethical, illegal, and we get in trouble. Sometimes we are just completely overwhelmed by what life throws at us. We're just going along, doing our thing. We are living life, enjoying it. And all of a sudden it seems like we get overwhelmed or overrun by something. Some storm comes out on us. And we just don't know what in the world we're ever going to do. Now, part of the reason we have all that is just simply because of the world that we live in. We live in a fallen, broken world that needs to be redeemed. Jesus came into this world to redeem us. Let me get rid of these. Jesus came into this world to redeem us, to redeem the sinfulness that dwells in our hearts. But he also came into this world to repair the fracture that sin caused in the natural world. Jesus came to redeem. This morning I want us to look at a passage in Mark chapter 4 where the disciples find themselves in a storm and they call on Jesus to do something. Mark chapter 4. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There was also other boats with them. A furious squall came up upon the waves and broke over the sides of the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. And Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. And the disciples awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care if we drown?" And he got up and he rebuked the wind and the waves, saying, "Quiet, be still." And then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. And he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were terrified, and they asked each other, "Who is this, that even the winds and the waves obey him?" Jesus is back in Capernaum. In Matthew chapter 4, Matthew tells us that Jesus moved from Nazareth to Capernaum. We assume, and I put this together from some of the things I've read in the Gospels, that he moved his mother and his brothers with him. His sisters apparently had already been married off, and so they were still in Nazareth. But he is in Capernaum, and he begins his ministry there in Capernaum. And you can read the opening chapters of Mark and see what happens there. But Jesus is in the midst of what we call the Galilean ministry. And he goes down to the seashore and he begins to teach people. And I have to wonder if Jesus, that wasn't a regular practice of his even before he began his public ministry, where he would go down to the seashore and maybe, walk along the edge of the water, talking with the fishermen, see if they needed anything repaired in their boats, because he was a carpenter. But Capernaum was also a hot spot of conservatism for the Jewish religion. And so I have to wonder if he didn't get into some conversations with those fishermen and with Matthew on the tax collector as he walked by his booth. And of course it says that he was teaching in the synagogue. And I have to wonder if Jesus didn't stand up in the synagogue one day and begin to teach and the people go, "Whoa, where did all this come from?" And so people just began to gather around him and he began to teach them. And then he begins his public ministry and he begins to do the miracles, and now they're just flocking to him. So this particular day, Jesus is down at the lakeside and people begin to come to him, and they get there's so many of them. They're pressing him back and pressing him back. He's on the edge of the lake. He hollers at one of the fishermen. It has to be, I'm assuming, the James and John, sons of Zebedee fishing crew, whatever it was. He climbs into one of their boats. And they back it off the shore so he can use the water as an amplifier. And he stands there for the day teaching these people. And he gets to the end of the day, and Jesus is exhausted. And he turns to who's ever running the boat and says, let's go to the other side. Now we know from what we see in the story that most likely all 12 disciples were in this boat. So it was probably a rather large boat. Wasn't your typical John boat, okay? And so he's in the boat, and he says to them, hey, look, I'm done for the day. Let's go to the other side. Now, there's a couple interesting things that take place here. Jesus has been talking to the crowds. He has nothing with him, probably unprepared for any kind of trip. I think of what it takes us. We're going to be gone for a day next week. And I'm thinking, it's going to take me 2 hours to get everything together that I have to take with me just for a day. And Jesus is in this boat, and he's going, all those people there, no, I'm done. I'm going over here. I don't care if I have my travel bag with me or not. We were talking about this in Sunday school this morning. There were times when Jesus just withdrew from the crowds. He just had to go and spend time with the Father. He just had to go and recuperate from everything that he was doing. And so he withdraws from the crowd. He says, I want to go to the other side of the lake. And from Mark chapter 5, we know he ends up in the region of the Gadarenes. If they went straight across the lake, we're talking about a 6 to 10 mile journey. If they went around the edge of the lake, it would have been considerably more. But anyway, they're headed off. The end of the day is coming. Jesus goes into the back side of the boat, and larger boats would have a cushion there for any kind of dignitary that they might have on the boat crossing the lake. He sits down on that cushion and falls dead asleep. He's exhausted from the day's teaching. And if you've ever done public speaking, you know the adrenaline rises a little bit. You're working through all of your outline and your plans, and you're presenting those things carefully. And when you're done, and that adrenaline shuts off, there's this almost crash. That's why preachers take naps on Sunday afternoon. So he crashes in the back of the boat. They head off across the lake. And things are going pretty well. You got Peter, James, and John were fishermen. They were men who spent their lives on the lake. They've probably been on the lake their entire lives. And they know the signs. Now, the Sea of Galilee is in an interesting position in the world because it actually sits below sea level. You've got the Mediterranean Sea out here. You've got a mountain range right here. And then you've got the Sea of Galilee. And I'm told what happens is the winds blow in off the Mediterranean, up across the mountains, and then come crashing down through the valleys that lead into the Sea of Galilee. And so you have these windstorms that come up and blow across the lake. Now, sometimes they would last maybe 10, 15 minutes and be done. Other times they could last what seemed like eternity. Now, you and I don't know, most of you probably lived I've lived in Kansas for 24 years. And I know in the summertime that the heat builds up, the humidity builds up, and that leads to thunderstorms, some of them severe, tornadoes. We live in Tornado Alley. But one of the things I've noticed over the years is that sometimes the most severe storms that we have come at night. If that storm has enough energy to last into the night, it can be horribly severe. Greensburg wiped out in the middle of the night. The same was true apparently about the Sea of Galilee. Sometimes the storms would blow across the sea during the day, during the heat of the day, when all the air is rising and moving, and The wind would push across there, cause a storm, boom, it'd be done. But there would be other times if a storm came up at night that it could be really severe. It could be really severe. I can see Peter standing on the bow of the ship, because that's where Peter belongs, right, on the bow, because he's the head guy. He's standing up there on the bow while some of the lesser disciples are at their oars. And Andrew comes up. And he looks at Andrew out of the corner of his eye, looks up at the sky, and Andrew says, James and John are concerned. Peter looks back up at the sky and goes, yeah, I understand. Should we tell the rest of them? No, not yet. The wind begins to pick up. This time, James comes to the front of the boat. Hey, Peter, what do you think? I don't know. We've lost the sun, but the wind's still blowing, and it's picking up. That's not a good sign. And then the boat starts to toss because the wind's picking up. And when the boat starts to toss, the rest of the guys start looking at Peter, James, John, and Andrew going, what's going on? And the boat's tossing. And then it begins to pitch. So we're going up and down, side to side. And they start to freak. Somebody's coming to Peter going, hey, what's going on? It's kind of obvious. We have a storm. What's going on? Peter's trying to keep them cool while he's inside going, oh man, we are in trouble. So finally, the ship is pitching, the wind's blowing in a gale force, it's pitching back and forth. Everybody is just in a total and complete panic. Somebody's screaming, we're all going to die. And then suddenly somebody realizes, where in the world is Jesus? Because they're all in the middle of the boat, they're panicking, they're crying, they're trying to figure out what to do next, they're holding on for dear life, and then somebody realizes, where is Jesus? And they all turn around, look in the back of the boat, and there he is. For a split second, or maybe a couple of seconds, the fear that is within them all turns to anger. Peter, who has been standing on the bow, marches to the stern of the boat, and maybe at first he's a little gentle, grabs Jesus by the shoulder. Jesus! Jesus! Jesus is out. Finally, grabs him by both shoulders, shakes him awake, and goes, don't you care about us? We are about to drown. Jesus is sitting there on his cushion, having been shaken awake, hearing this din of Peter's voice in his ears, and then waking up to the pitch and the roll of the ship and the wind in his face. And I can see him looking up at the disciples, blinking his eyes, trying to focus, and thinking, what in the world is going on? And when finally he's awake enough to realize what is happening, I can see him pushing through the disciples and going out to the stern of the boat, because he's got to go to the stern of the boat, right? I mean the bow of the boat, right? You can't calm the wind in the sea from the stern, right? You got to go out to the bow of the ship where it's pitching and going like this. So he goes out there. Okay, and this is conjecture on my part. I like to make up stories. I like to put little energy in things. So I can see Jesus. He's wandering across the boat, hanging on to the rigging as he goes to the front of the boat. And he looks up at the sky. He's holding on, and he goes, would you guys knock it off? What's the guy to do around here? Get some sleep. Turns around, walks back to the stern. All the disciples are standing there going, what in the world just happened? Because Jesus hollers out, would you be quiet? Would you knock it off? And all of a sudden, the wind stops blowing, and the sea becomes as calm and still as glass. He wanders back to his cushion, sits back down, and on the way through he goes, "What in the world is wrong with you guys? Where is your faith?" Sits back down on the cushion and goes back to sleep. They're all standing there going, looking at each other, looking at him, and again and going, "What in the world just happened?" Some observations from the text. Jesus is standing there. He's teaching that day. He says, let's go over to the other side. He wants to get away from the crowds. But there's a little something here that none of the other writers pick up. Mark says, and there were also other boats with him. There were also other boats with him. Jesus is out in the lake. It's calm enough that he's using the water as a reflector to amplify his voice. But there are other people who can't that are on the There are other people who, because they're in boats, begin to gather around him also to hear his teaching. And I also have to wonder, because Jesus has an entourage. It's not just the 12. You remember in the book of Acts, they're trying to replace Judas. And they say, we need somebody who has been with us from the baptism of John to Jesus' resurrection. They came up with 2 guys. Somebody who's been with us from the baptism of John to the resurrection. So Jesus not only had the disciples hanging around, but he had other people hanging around as well. Remember, he sends out the 72 to the villages and towns around the northern part of Galilee. So Jesus has this mini entourage following him around. And we don't know, Mark doesn't tell us, none of the other gospel writers even mention it. Did these other boats go with Jesus to the other side of the lake? Were they following him or over there to the other side of the lake? But my point being is, the disciples were not alone in this. They were not alone. It's possible the other boats followed them across, and they were caught in the storm as well. And they were just as amazed at what happened as the disciples were. When the storms of life come upon us, what we need to understand and what we need to realize is that if we're alone, it's our fault. If we're alone, it's our fault. There's an old line from a Christian song that says, if you're lonely, you're the only one to blame. Because God works and moves in the lives of his saints, in the lives of his people, to bring help, comfort, counsel to you. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul says this, praise be to the God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion, and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort that we ourselves have received from God. We don't often think about it in these terms, but sometimes God allows us to go through a storm to learn about who he is, but also to comfort others who will go through that same storm. Who will go through that same storm. If you're lonely, if you're alone and you're battling something, if you're facing a storm alone, you're the only one to blame. God has put people around you. God has put people in your circle of influence who would love to step in and help if you would only invite them in. And then it says, teacher, don't you care if we drowned? Don't you care if we drowned? I have to admit, there have been times in my life I've wanted to turn toward heaven, shake my fist at God, and go, what in the world are you thinking? You obviously don't care about me. You obviously don't care about my family. What were you thinking? And obviously that speaks to the crisis of the moment. We've all have been there at some point in time in our life. And if you haven't been there yet, believe me, you will be. We have that moment of, God, do you really care about me? Don't you understand where I am? Don't you understand what's going on? Don't you care about me anymore? And sometimes in the midst of where we are, we don't see what God is trying to do, what He's trying to accomplish in our lives. Jesus, on the other hand, is in the back of the boat, and He knows exactly what God is going to do in His life. He knows exactly where He is headed. He knows fully, because He is God, what the Father has in store for Him. Jesus is in the back of the boat, asleep. He knows that that the boat is not going to flip over, and they are not all going to drown, because God has a mission and a purpose for him. Jesus was to go to the cross. Jesus was to die for the sins of the world. He was to die to bring about redemption. He's asleep in the back of the boat, fully confident of what the Father has for him, and fully confident that he is going to fulfill that purpose and that mission. And when he comes to the disciples and he says to them, "Where is your faith?" He's questioning their understanding of who he is. And it's my contention, and you all might disagree with me, is that when the New Testament talks about faith, when the Gospels talk about faith, it has to do with an understanding of who Jesus is. And it might be a minuscule understanding, it might be a big understanding. But Jesus looks at them and says, "Where is your faith?" The implication being, you don't understand who I am. Through the Gospel of John, John says about 4, maybe 5 times that the disciples believed in him. The disciples believed in him. And what I think John is trying to hint at there is that our growth and our knowledge and faith in Jesus Christ is something that is ongoing and continual. For the disciples, when they first began to follow Jesus, they may have thought of him as a great teacher. They began to think of him as that military Messiah that would come and set the Israel free. But they finally came to the point after the resurrection where they fully understood, because of their experiences with Jesus, who he was. And at this point, they don't understand who he is. They don't have a comprehension of what he wants, what he came to do, and who he was. Because I'm here, I see the disciples panicking, the ship's pitching and it's rolling, and they're thinking, "Where is Jesus? Why is he not up here?" And my question is, in their understanding, why in the world did they want Jesus to come up to the front of the boat? What was he going to do? They'd seen him do miracles and heal people, but what else did they think he could do? Did they want him to come up to the middle of the boat, have them all hold hands and sing Kumbaya so they could all drown together? Well, what did they want him to do? And when they wake him up and holler at him and say, "You don't care about us," he gets up and he rebukes the wind and the waves, and he comes back and goes, "Do you not understand who I am? Do you not understand yet who I am?" And he goes back and sits down. What he was trying to help them understand was the safest place that they could be in the world at that time was with him in the middle of that storm. The safest place for the disciples at that moment in time was with him in the middle of that storm. That ship was not going to be swamped. That ship was not going to tip over. It was not going to sink because Jesus was on the boat. Unfortunately, we don't have the privilege of the physical presence of Jesus. And he said that was good. we do have, as followers of Christ, the spiritual presence of the Holy Spirit dwelling within us. Dwelling within us. And that helps us understand that God has a purpose, God has a plan, God has a mission, and He's involved us in that mission. He knows which direction that mission is going. But we, like the disciples, have no idea. And we can only go one step at a time. And the only option we have in the middle of the storm is to say, Jesus, I trust you. See me through this storm. Because the safest place we can be is with Jesus, no matter where that may lead us. Verse 41 says, they were terrified and asked each other, who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. As much as we as American Christians want to have total safety and security, which is basically an illusion, we need the tough times in life. We need those struggles. And we need them because it shows us who God is. I want to take you back to the Old Testament for a minute and go back to the book of Job. Job's a great guy, religious guy. Not only is he, but he is faithful. And his quote-unquote religion is not something that he simply does, but it is something that is a part of his life. He has what we would say in our day and time, a personal relationship with his Creator and loves God with all of his heart. And then his world starts to fall apart. All of his children are killed in a tornado. Some various enemies come and steal his livestock, kill his servants. And in the process of that, Job loses all of his wealth. And if that isn't bad enough, he has 3 friends who come along and say, hey, Job, what sin have you done to incur all of this wrath of God? Those are the kind of friends I want all the time, right? So Job loses everything. And if you if you can patiently read through the book of Job and listen to him moan and complain and whine and listen to his friends accuse him of doing things he never did, he gets to the end of the book and he finally gets his wish because in his complaints he says, God, I want my day in court. I want my day in court. In chapter 38, Job gets his day in court. God stands up in front of him and says, you answer like a man. Tell me, where were you when? God asked that question several different times. Where were you when I made the heavens and the earth? Where were you when I created Leviathan? Where were you when? And Job stands there and goes, well, And the funny thing about it is Job never really understands why what happened to him happened. He never understood that. But what he did understand when he finished that storm in his life was that there was a God who was great and sovereign and who cared about him. There are things I think that Job understood about God that never occurred to him before because of the storm he went through. I can personally tell you that there are things about God that I didn't understand completely or fully until the storms of life. Who was it? Tozer who said, upon hearing a young woman sing a beautiful song, turning to his wife saying, "She hasn't suffered enough." And there are things that the storms of life bring to us as a realization of who God is and sometimes what He's trying to do and accomplish in our lives. And sometimes we come through a storm and we have no answer to our questions. Job's questions were never answered. And we come through those storms of life, God has never answered our question, but when we get to the end, we go, "Oh God, how great and mighty you are." And maybe we respond like David did, "Oh God, who am I that you would have anything to do with me?" The song that we sang this morning says, "In the eye of the storm, you remain in control. In the middle of the war, you guard my soul. You alone are my anchor when my sails are torn. Your love surrounds me in the eye of the storm." I want to conclude this morning with a psalm. It's unfortunate that we only hear this at funerals because it was intended for us to read it when the storms of life come. You'll recognize it immediately. "The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters, and He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for You are with me. Your rod and Your staff, they comfort me. You prepare before me in the presence of my enemies. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, and You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Our challenge this morning is simply this: to know and to understand that God is even in the storm. He's not left you. He's not forsaken you. He is walking with you. He is walking with you. And whatever His purposes are, if you will be open to them, He will fulfill them in you and through you. Because sometimes you're walking through the storm so other people can see how you're handling it. And some of those people may be fellow followers of Christ who have their own crisis. Some of them may be people who you've been talking to about Jesus. You've been living your life out in front of them. And now they need to see the power and the might of God in your life. There are so many dynamics when it comes to the struggles that we face. But the key is saying, "God, I trust You. Take my hand. Walk me through this storm." Let's pray. Oh, Father God, we come before You. We acknowledge Your goodness and Your grace. We acknowledge Your sovereignty and Your love for us. Oh, Father, no matter what we may encounter from day to day, use that for the glory and the good of Your kingdom, so that You may be honored and glorified. We ask these things in Your precious name. Amen.